Hi, welcome to our session today on the organization of the human body. My name is Galen. I'm a registered nurse. I'm going to be presenting the information today. So, let's talk about the organization of the human body. What do we mean by that? Well, in a nutshell, it just means organizing the body in different ways. Pretty simple, right? But why is this something that we need to devote an entire tutoring session to? Why is this important as we pursue the study of anatomy and physiology? Well, being able to organize the human body in different ways, being able to section it out or divide it up using these different methods helps us essentially zoom in on different parts of the body so that we can focus on those parts and better understand them, better understand their role in relation to other parts of the body, better understand their place in the body and how they function within the body's various systems, how they interact with one another, with other parts of the body. And so essentially this just helps us understand where things are in the body and allows us to look at those different parts from different angles and enhances our understanding of them. Before we review the material and practice questions, I want to remind you that in order to pass your TEAS exam, it's important to make sure you're studying everything that is on the test and also using a study resource that you're going to love using. Our study course not only makes it simple to study for the TEAS by condensing the materials to just one login and one app, but we make learning interactive with our different visuals, our lessons, study prompts, and more. Check out our TEAS test prep course at www.smarteditionacademy.com. So we'll start out with talking about levels of structural organization, and there are 7 of those by which we can organize the body. We start out with the smallest level, the chemical level, and each level builds upon the previous one. So we're starting out small and basic, and we're growing in complexity as we progress to the final level, and you'll see what I mean here in a moment. So the chemical level is the smallest level of organization, of structural organization, and it involves the interaction among atoms. These are the smallest unit of matter that still have all the characteristics of an element. So think of them as the basic building blocks of matter. Now, atoms can be broken up further into protons, electrons, neutrons, but those individual substances don't have all the properties of an element as atoms do. So atoms, like I said, are the smallest unit of matter with all the characteristics of an element. And so that's why this represents the smallest level of structural organization, the interaction among atoms and their combination into molecules. So you can see that illustrated in the first part of this picture here. That's the chemical level. Next, not explicitly labeled in this diagram, but you can see it represented by these tiny blue circles here in this cell, is the organelle level. So an organelle is a small structure within a cell, again represented by the tiny blue dots here, and they are responsible for performing one or more specific functions. So think of them like tiny organs in a cell, and that'll make more sense when we cover the organ level in just a moment. But essentially this is the cell's tiny organ that is performing one or more specific functions for that cell, an organelle. Next we have the cellular level, and cells are the basic functional units of life. A cell can be thought of as a whole, as we'll see later on. It can be a simple whole. All cells share many characteristics, but they do differ in structure and function depending on where they are located and what their purpose is. So they have similarities, they have differences as well. After cell, we have the tissue level. A tissue is a group of cells with similar structures and functions, and we can add to that similar extracellular substances between or among their cells. And after that, we have the organ level. An organ is a structure that is composed of 2 or more tissue types that work together to perform one or more common functions. So think of the heart, think of the liver, the pancreas, etc. Now, an organ system is a group of organs that get classified together as a unit because they all work together to perform a common function or set of functions. So in our diagram here, we have the digestive system pictured with all of the various digestive organs. So they each play a role in allowing our body to digest the food that we consume. So they work together to accomplish that function. And finally, the last level of structural organization is the organism level. So an organism is any living thing that may be considered as a whole. So they can be as simple, like we said earlier, as one single cell that can be considered as a whole, or as complex as our human bodies made up of trillions of cells all working together to perform various functions. So you can see how we're starting with the smallest elements of matter and we're building on each level is building on the previous one until we end up with something extraordinarily complex, but still something harmonious where all the various parts down to the atoms and molecules are working together in concert to accomplish these functions and promote life within that being. All right, so another way that we can talk about organizing the body and dividing the body into different parts is to look at the body cavities. The human body has many cavities. Some of them open up to the exterior of the body. Essentially, a body cavity is a fluid-filled space that is responsible for holding and protecting our internal organs. The human body has 2 major cavities, the ventral cavity and the dorsal cavity. And each of these can be subdivided further into smaller cavities, as we will see. So the ventral cavity is found in the front of the body. You can see it illustrated here by this green cavity and this blue and purple cavity. As is evident from our diagram, the ventral cavity can be subdivided into 3 separate cavities. The top one is the thoracic cavity. It's surrounded in the front and on the sides by the rib cage, and it's separated from the abdominal cavity underneath it by a muscle called the diaphragm, as you can see illustrated here. There is also a structure within the thoracic cavity called the mediastinum that divides it into right and left halves. The thoracic cavity contains many essential organs, including the esophagus, the trachea, the thymus gland, the heart, and both lungs, along with other structures. Underneath it, as we've already mentioned, is the abdominal cavity, so separated from the thoracic cavity above it by that muscle, the diaphragm, and bounded in the front by the abdominal muscles. The abdominal cavity contains many of the digestive organs, including part of the intestines, the stomach, the liver, the spleen, and the pancreas. It also contains the kidneys. Below the abdominal cavity, we have the pelvic cavity, which is enclosed by the bones of the pelvis. It contains the remainder of the intestines, as well as the urinary bladder and the internal reproductive organs. Now, sometimes people refer to the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity collectively as the abdominopelvic cavity, but they are technically 2 separate cavities. The dorsal cavity is the second major cavity in the human body, and it is found on the back of the body. You can see it illustrated in orange here. So it can be subdivided into 2 cavities. The cranial cavity is found in the head, and it contains the brain, while the spinal or vertebral cavity runs along the back, and starting in the neck, runs along the back all the way down to here, and it contains the spinal cord. So its name makes sense, right? These names give us a hint as to where these cavities are located and possibly what structures they contain as well. All right, so let's go through some practice questions. I know that was a lot of information and a lot of terms, so let's reinforce some of what we've just learned with these practice questions. Which of the following levels of body organization involves the interactions between atoms and molecules? Is it A, the cellular level? Is it B, the chemical level? Is it C, the level of organs? Or is it D, the level of tissues? And our correct answer here is option B, the chemical level. So it might help you to remember that chemistry is the branch of science dealing with substances being broken down into their most basic parts. So remember that atoms are the basic unit of a chemical element that still retain all the characteristics of that element, while molecules are the smallest fundamental unit of a chemical compound that are formed when a group of atoms bonds together. We can also define a chemical as a compound or substance with a defined composition that is made up of these atoms and molecules. And so this is, again, the smallest level of body organization. And based on the definition of those terms, it makes sense that this smallest level would be called the chemical level and that it would involve the interactions between or among atoms and molecules. So what about these other levels here? Well, remember that a cell is the smallest basic functional unit of life. An organ is two or more tissue types that together perform one or several common functions, while tissues are a group of cells with similar structure, function, as well as extracellular substances between its cells. So none of these other definitions really jive with what we're being asked about in our practice question. The best answer, as we've seen, is option B, chemical. So that is our right answer here. Blank are composed of two or more tissue types that together perform one or more common functions. Is it A, cells? Is it B, chemicals? Is it C, organs? Or is it D, tissues? And the correct answer is option C, organs. And you may have caught that as we were going through the wrong answers in the previous practice question. Kind of gave this definition here, gave it away. But remember again that organs are structures that are made up of two or more types of tissue that work together to perform one or more common functions. So think of the kidneys, for example. Think of the lungs. Those are examples of organs found in the human body, and you can probably think of many other examples as well, since we have so many organs in our bodies. Now, since the word tissue is here in the practice question, it cannot be the right answer. But remember that a tissue is a group of cells with similar structure, function, and extracellular substances among its cells. So tissue is one level below the level of organs. So again, not our right answer here. Cells, again, are the smallest functional unit of life, the smallest basic functional unit of life, and then chemicals, as we've seen, are made up of atoms and molecules, and is a compound or substance with a defined composition. So all three of these are smaller than the level of organization that we're being asked about in our practice question. So the correct answer is option C, organs. A or an blank is any living thing considered as a whole. Is it A, cell? Is it B, organ? Is it C, organism? Or is it D, variable? And the correct answer here is option C. An organism is any living thing that may be considered as a whole. Now, this may be as small and as simple as a single-celled organism, option A. Remember that a cell, as we've said, is the smallest basic functional unit of life, but it can also be as complex as our human bodies, made up of trillions of cells. And so A by itself is an incomplete answer. It may be correct, but when we're talking about organism, we can be talking about a wide range of different types of organisms. So C is a more complete answer than option A. We've already talked about organs, so we know that that does not fit the definition that we're being asked about here, and we can eliminate that as incorrect. What about this last option, option D, the variable? Well, variables are conditions like temperature or chemical content or volume that must be maintained within a narrow range of normal for the body to function properly. And we'll discuss that later on in the presentation in more detail. But for now, just know that variables are subject to change, and thus they need to be controlled. Now think back to the diagram that we went over when we were talking about the levels of organization, and you'll recall that variable was not one of those levels that we discussed. So again, we can eliminate this as incorrect. And we're left with option C, which, as we've seen, is the correct answer, is the best answer here. The ventral cavity, front of the body, contains blank major cavities. Is it A2? Is it B3? Is it C5? Or is it D9? So essentially we're being asked how many cavities can the ventral cavity be subdivided into. And if you think back to our diagram that we were looking at earlier, the correct answer is option B. The ventral cavity in the front of the body contains 3 major cavities. These include the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. Now, we did say that sometimes the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity are referred to collectively as the abdominopelvic cavity, but remember that even if that is the case, they are still technically distinguishable as separate cavities. So the correct answer here is option B3. It's the dorsal cavity, not the ventral cavity, that located in the back of the body, that can be divided into 2 major cavities, the cranial and the spinal or vertebral. And so together, the dorsal and the ventral cavity contain a total of 5 major cavities, option C. 9 is much too many, so that answer is incorrect. We can eliminate that. And again, option C and option A are referring to different divisions of the cavities than what we're being asked about in this question here. Here we're being asked only about the ventral cavity. And as we've seen, the correct answer is 3, option B. Which cavity is surrounded by the rib cage and separated from the abdominal cavity by the diaphragm? Is it A, the abdominal cavity? Is it B, the gastric cavity? Is it C, the pelvic cavity? Or is it D, the thoracic cavity? And the correct answer here is option D, the thoracic cavity. So this is the cavity that's surrounded by the rib cage and separated from the abdominal cavity by the diaphragm. Now, since we have the phrase abdominal cavity in our practice question, we know that that cannot be our correct answer because the abdominal cavity would not be separated from itself. That doesn't make any sense. So we can eliminate that as incorrect. Gastric is not one of the cavities that we saw. So that is incorrect as well because that's not one of the names of the different cavities in the human body. And then the pelvic cavity is separated from the thoracic cavity by the abdominal cavity. So the thoracic cavity is located in the chest, the abdominal cavity is located below it, and then the pelvic cavity is located in the pelvis, as its name implies. So that can't be our correct answer either. And we're left with option D, thoracic, and that is our correct answer, as we have seen. Which of the following organs is located in the pelvic cavity? Is it A, the heart? Is it B, the intestines? Is it C, the liver? Or is it D, the pancreas? And the correct answer here is option B. Remember that part of the intestines are indeed located in the pelvic cavity, along with the bladder and the internal reproductive organs. The rest of the intestines, along with the liver, pancreas, and other structures, are found in the abdominal cavity, while the heart, option A, is found in the thoracic cavity. So the only structure listed here that is found in the pelvic cavity is option B, the intestines, and that is our correct answer. What are the subdivisions of the dorsal cavity located in the back of the human body? Is it A, cranial and spinal? Is it B, dorsal and ventral? Is it C, lateral and proximal? Or is it D, inferior and superior? And the correct answer is option A. The dorsal cavity can be divided into the cranial cavity located in the head and containing the brain, and the spinal cavity or the vertebral cavity, which runs along the back and contains the spinal cord. Our other answer options here are what are known as directional terms, and we'll cover that in the next section. But suffice it to say that these are not names of the subdivisions of body cavities, as we've seen. So recall back to our diagram that we were examining earlier. The major body cavities are indeed dorsal and ventral, but we are being asked specifically about subdivisions, and even more specifically about the subdivisions of the dorsal cavity. So B cannot be our correct answer, as it's asking about the broad divisions of body cavities, front and back, and not the specific subdivisions. And then C and D, like I said, are directional terms, not the names of the body cavities. So these answers are incorrect as well, and we're left with option A, which is our correct answer. All right, so with that little introduction to terminology, directional terminology, specifically, let's move into that. And before we get into those specific directional terms, let's talk about anatomical position and why it's important. So when we're talking about anatomical position, we are referring to a person standing erect or upright with their feet facing forward, their arms hanging down at their sides, and the palms of their hands facing forward as well. This position is important because when we use directional terms, as we'll see in the following slides, we are always referring to the body in anatomical position, regardless of its actual position. And we do that to avoid confusion. Because if one person is picturing the body with the arms hanging at the side, but another person is picturing the body with the arms extended overhead, then directionally, the body parts located on that arm, if it's overhead instead of at the side, are going to be, the terms that that person would use would be different than the person who was picturing the arms hanging at the side. So to make sure that we're all on the same level, that we're all talking about body parts in the same position, and to avoid chaos and confusion, directional terms are always referring to anatomical position. So keep that in mind as we go through these terms and as we work through the practice questions following this terminology. So here are the terms that you need to know. We're going to go through them rather quickly here. The word inferior indicates that one structure is below another. The word superior is the opposite of that. It indicates that a structure is above another. Our next two sets of terms, anterior, posterior, and dorsal ventral, are synonymous. So anterior and ventral both mean toward the front of the body. So think of the ventral cavity that we discussed a moment ago. We saw that that was indeed in the front of the body. So it makes sense that that would be the definition of this word ventral. And again, synonymous with the word anterior. While the words posterior and dorsal are the opposite of those two words, but are also synonymous. So again, think of the dorsal cavity, and it's found in the back of our body. So it makes sense that it would mean toward the back. The word proximal indicates that one body part is closer to the point of attachment to the rest of the body than another body part is, while the word distal has the opposite meaning. A body part is farther from the point of attachment to the rest of the body than another structure is. So think of your leg. We could say that the knee is proximal to the ankle. That means that the knee is closer to where the leg as a whole attaches to the rest of the body than is the ankle. Conversely, we could say that the ankle is distal to the knee, meaning that the ankle is further away from where the leg as a whole attaches to the body than the knee is. The word lateral means away from the midline of the body, while the word medial means toward the middle or midline of the body. So if you draw a line straight down the middle of the body, dividing it into equal right and left halves, medial would be towards that line, lateral would be away from that, further out from that. The word superficial means toward or on the surface of the body, while the word deep means away from the surface, so closer to the inner parts of the body. The word anterosuperior is a combination of the word anterior and the words superior, so it means in front or above. The word midline means a median line. Again, that's a line running down the middle of the body or a body part, dividing it into equal right and left halves. And then we have two other positional terms. The supine position indicates that a person is lying flat on their back with their face and their torso facing upward, while the prone position is the opposite. They're lying face down with their back facing upward. So those terms are important to know as well. We can also talk about body planes. These are ways of sectioning the body to be able to look inside and observe the various structures and organs from different angles. So there are four major planes that we're going to talk about today. The sagittal plane, here in pink, runs vertically through the body from front to back, and it separates the body into right and left parts. The mid-sagittal plane is a particular type of sagittal plane that runs right through the midline of the body, right through the center, and divides it into equal right and left halves, so mirror images of one another. The coronal plane is sometimes also called the frontal plane. It's illustrated in blue here, and it is another vertical plane, but instead of running front to back like the sagittal plane, it runs through the body from left to right, and it divides the body into anterior, a front part, and posterior, a back part, as you can see pictured here. And then finally, the transverse plane is the only horizontal plane. It runs parallel to the surface of the ground, and it divides the body into superior and inferior planes. In other words, an upper half and a lower half. As you can see pictured here, it's illustrated in green. So you can see how all of these planes divide the body up into different ways, and this gives us a unique perspective on the structures of the body from each of those different angles. Now, the last topic of this section is body regions. We can further divide the body into the following four regions. We can talk about the upper limbs, which include the arm, the forearm, the wrist, and the hand. We can talk about the lower limbs, which include the thighs, the legs, the ankles, and the feet. We can talk about the central region of the body that includes the neck and the trunk. And we can talk about the head region, which includes, you guessed it, the entire head. So four kind of major regions of the body that we can talk about. Another way of organizing the body into different parts so that we can focus on individual parts specifically. All right, so let's go through some practice questions here. Which term is synonymous with the term posterior? Is it A, dorsal? Is it B, inferior? Is it C, proximal? Or is it D, superior? And the correct answer here is option A. The term dorsal is synonymous with the term posterior. They both mean toward the back of the body. And it might help you to remember that sea creatures such as whales, sharks, dolphins have on their back something called a dorsal fin. And it makes sense that it's named the dorsal fin because it's located on the backs of their bodies. So sometimes silly associations like that can help things stick in your mind. So as you're going through these terms, one tip to help you learn them is to think of kind of a weird or unusual, unconventional association. And that might help you remember some of these more difficult terms a little bit better. So what about the other terms here? Well, the word inferior means that a structure is below another. The word superior is opposite of that. It means that a structure is above another. So different than what we're being asked about with the definition of the word posterior here. Incorrect answers for this particular question. And then the word proximal indicates that a structure is nearer to the point of attachment on the body than another structure is. So think of the arm. We could say that our elbow is proximal to our fingertips because the elbow is closer to where the arm as a whole attaches to the rest of the body than are the fingertips. So again, a different definition than the word posterior, clearly not a synonym for that term. So B, C, and D are incorrect, and the correct answer, as we've seen, is option A, the word dorsal. Now, what anatomical term means away from the surface? Is it A, anterior? Is it B, deep? Is it C, proximal? Or is it D, ventral? And the correct answer here is option B. The word deep is a term that means away from the surface. So if you've ever swam in any body of water that you can completely submerge underneath, maybe you've swum down as low as you can go and you've looked back up and you can see the surface of the water far above you. So that might help you remember the definition of this word deep, being away from the surface, and you can look up and see it way above you up there, and you are deep in relation to where the surface of the water is. In the same way, when we're talking about a structure in the body being deep, we're talking about it being away from the surface of the body, the skin, and much closer to the inner parts of the body. So hopefully that helps that term kind of stick in your heads a little bit better. So what about our other terms here? Well, the word anterior means something is toward the front of the body. It's synonymous with the word ventral, as we have seen, which also means toward the front of the body. So again, think of the ventral cavity located in the front part of the body. So these do not mean away from the surface, so we can eliminate them as incorrect. And then we've already talked about the meaning of the word proximal in our previous practice question. The one right before this, it means that a body structure is nearer to the point of attachment to the rest of the body than is another structure. For example, the wrist is proximal to the thumb because the wrist is closer to where the arm as a whole attaches to the body than our thumbs are. So again, this term does not mean away from the surface either, and we can eliminate that as incorrect as well. And we're left with option B, deep, which is the correct answer as we've seen. Which anatomical position promotes access to the stomach? Is it A, medial? Is it B, prone? Is it C, superficial? Or is it D, supine? And the correct answer is going to be option D. The supine position promotes access to the stomach. So when a person is in the supine position, they are lying flat on their backs. Both their face and their torso are facing upward. So if you picture a person in this position, yes, that does grant easy access to the stomach. In contrast, if a person were lying in the prone position, they would be lying face down. So their back would be facing upward, and it would be hard to access their stomachs this way. So that answer cannot be correct. And then the term medial and the term superficial, answer options A and C, do not indicate positions, rather they're directional terms. Medial indicates that something is toward the middle or midline of the body. while superficial indicates that something is toward or on the surface of the body. So neither of these answers really make sense based on the question that we're being asked as far as promoting access to the stomach. So they are incorrect as well. And we're left with option D, supine, which, as we've seen, is an answer that makes sense and is thus our correct answer. The lips are blank to the neck. A, anterior, B, deep, C, inferior, or D, superior. And the correct answer here is option D. The lips are superior to the neck. And what do we mean by that? Well, remember that the term superior means that one structure is above another when the body is in anatomical position. So if you're picturing a person standing upright, their arms are hanging at their sides, the palms of their hands and their feet are facing forward, then yes, indeed, their lips would be above their necks in that position. The word inferior is the opposite of the word superior. So it indicates that a structure is below another structure. So if our practice question were flipped and we were being asked the neck is blank to the lips, then inferior would be an appropriate answer because in anatomical position, the neck is below the lips, as we have seen. The word deep means away from the surface of the body, so that's not a correct answer here for this particular question. And the word anterior means toward the front of the body. So again, that doesn't make sense when we're comparing the position of the lips in relation to the neck. So A, B, and C are incorrect as we have seen, and we're left with option D, superior, which is our correct answer here. The shoulder is blank to the fingertips. Is it A, distal? Is it B, inferior? Is it C, proximal? Or is it D, superficial? And the correct answer here is option C, that word proximal. So we've talked about proximal in several of our practice questions thus far. Remember that this term means that one body structure is closer to the point of attachment to the rest of the body than another structure. So when we're thinking about anatomical position, it makes sense that the shoulder is proximal to the fingertips because the shoulder is closer to where the arm as a whole attaches to the rest of the body than are the fingertips. The word distal is the opposite of the word proximal. So distal means that a structure would be further away from the point of attachment than another structure. So if our practice question were reversed and we were being asked the fingertips are blank to the shoulder, then the correct answer would be distal because the fingertips, as we've seen, are further away from the point of attachment of the arm as a whole than the shoulder is. But that's not what our practice question is asking us, so that answer is incorrect. The word inferior, as we've seen, means that a structure is below another, while the word superficial means that something is toward or on the surface of the body. So neither of those answers make sense here, and our best answer is option C, proximal. Now the wrist is blank to the shoulder. Is it A, distal? Is it B, lateral? Is it C, median? Or is it D, superior? And the correct answer here is option A, distal. So this is very similar to the practice question that we just went through. Remember that the term distal indicates that one structure is further away from the point of attachment to the body than another structure. So when we're thinking about a person in anatomical position, this is certainly true of the wrist in relation to the shoulder. The wrist is further away from where the arm as a whole attaches to the rest of the body than the shoulder is. So that makes sense that distal is our correct answer. Let's briefly run through these other terms before we move on to our next section. The word lateral means away from the midline, while the word median means toward the midline, toward the center of the body or a body part. And the word superior, as we've seen, means that a structure is above another. And let me just point out real quick that this should be medial with an L. The word median indicates a midline, but the correct directional term is medial with an L. All right, which plane of the body divides the body into two equal halves? Is it A, the coronal plane? Is it B, the mid-sagittal plane? Is it C, the sagittal plane? Or is it D, the transverse plane? And the key word here in our question is the term equal. So the correct answer here is B, the mid-sagittal plane. So all of these are planes of the body, as we have seen, and thus they all divide the body into two parts, but only the mid-sagittal plane divides the body into two equal right and left halves that are essentially mirror images of each other. So that equal is the key word here, and that indicates that this is our correct answer. Remember that the mid-sagittal plane runs right down the center of the body, unlike these other planes here. When dissecting an organ, sometimes a blank cut needs to be made to divide the organ into top and bottom halves. Is it A, coronal? Is it B, mid-sagittal? Is it C, sagittal? Or is it D, transverse? The correct answer here is option D, transverse. And the key terms in this practice question are top and bottom. So in order for a structure to be divided into top and bottom halves, that means that the plane that's dividing it, or the cut in this case, needs to be horizontal. It needs to run parallel to the surface of the ground. The only horizontal plane that we have reviewed in this presentation is the transverse plane. The coronal, mid-sagittal, and sagittal planes are all vertical, so they would divide the body in different ways than what would result in a top and a bottom half. So transverse is the only answer that makes sense in the context of our practice question. And it's important to point out that when we're talking about these planes, we can be talking about dividing the body as a whole. We can also be talking about dividing specific body parts, such as when we're dissecting a particular organ, as this practice question is asking us about. And that's the value of all these different ways of organizing and sectioning and breaking down the body, is that we can really zoom in on different parts and learn the minute details of that part by being able to break it up in this variety of ways. So transverse is our correct answer because it is a horizontal plane and we're being asked to divide an organ into top and bottom halves. All right, so let's move on to tissues. So this is one of the levels of structural organization that we learned about earlier on in the presentation. And we've already defined a tissue as a group of cells that have similar structure and function, as well as extracellular substances located among the cells. In the human body, there are 4 primary types of tissue. Connective tissue is characterized by the extracellular material that separates its cells from one another. Of the 4 tissue types, connective tissue has the most diverse array of functions. It can enclose and separate. It can connect different tissue types to one another. It provides support and movement. It has storage capabilities. It can cushion and insulate. It can help with transportation, and it also helps with protection. So quite the variety of functions here. Examples of connective tissue include cells found in both the immune system as well as the blood. The second type of human tissue is epithelial tissue, and this can be classified according to the number of cell layers and shapes found within it. Epithelial tissue also serves a variety of functions, though not quite as many as connective tissue, which we've just seen. Some of epithelial tissue's functions include protecting structures lying underneath it, acting as a barrier, allowing for the passage of certain substances, also allowing for the secretion of certain substances. The skin and the linings of internal organs are good examples of epithelial tissue. The third type of human tissue is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue cells resemble long threads, and so we call them fibers. It has one primary function, and this is to provide movement. In addition to the muscles, the obvious answer, organs such as the heart, other organs of that are found in the digestive system contain muscle tissue as well. So muscle tissue is found in more than just the muscles, the heart, certain organs of the digestive system as well. And then the final type of human tissue that we're going to discuss today is neural tissue. The cells in neural tissue are composed of dendrites, cell bodies, and axons, so quite a unique cell shape and structure. Like muscle tissue, neural tissue has one particular function, and that is to coordinate and control many body activities. Neural tissue is found in the brain, the spinal cord, as well as the peripheral nerves. So the skin and linings of internal organs are examples of what type of tissue. Is it A, connective? Is it B, epithelial? Is it C, muscle? Or is it D, neural? And the correct answer is option B. Epithelial tissue is found in the skin as well as in the linings of internal organs. When we think about the functions of epithelial tissue, it makes sense that these parts of our body would contain this type of tissue. It acts as a barrier. It protects the structures that lie underneath it by keeping some substances out entirely, but also permitting the passage of useful, helpful substances and allowing for the secretion of other substances that the body needs to get rid of or that are needed for other things. So when we think about the locations of the skin and the linings of internal organs, as well as the function of epithelial tissue, it makes sense that it would be found in these locations. Connective tissue is found throughout the body, but specific examples include cells of the immune system as well as cells of the blood. Muscle tissue, as we've seen, is not just found in our muscles, but is also found in organs such as the heart and some organs of the digestive system as well. And then neural tissue is found in the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves as well. So these types of tissues are found in different parts of the body. The best answer for this particular question is epithelial tissue, as we have seen. Which type of tissue coordinates and controls many body activities? Is it A, connective tissue? Is it B, epithelial tissue? Is it C, muscle tissue? Or is it D, neural tissue? And the correct answer is option D. Neural tissue is responsible for coordinating and controlling many body activities. And again, if you think about the location of neural tissue, the brain, the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system, it makes sense that this would be this type of tissue's primary function because our nervous systems are what allow us to interact with the world around us. It's also responsible for communication between the brain and the rest of the body. So that makes sense. Based on where it's located, this function makes sense for this type of tissue. Muscle tissue has the function of providing movement, as we have seen. Epithelial tissue is a barrier, so it protects structures lying underneath it. It allows for the passage of certain substances. It allows for the secretion of certain substances. So different functions than coordinating and controlling body activities. So like muscle tissue, not the correct answer here. And then finally, connective tissue is that tissue that has such a diverse array of functions, but none of them include the coordination and control of body activities. So A, B, and C are incorrect because these type of tissues have different functions, and the correct answer is neural tissue, as we have seen. All right, so we'll spend the remainder of our time, about 10 minutes here, talking about homeostasis and feedback mechanisms. So I mentioned that term, homeostasis, maybe not explicitly, but kind of in a roundabout way a little bit earlier on in the presentation. So what do we mean by that term and why is it important? Homeostasis is the existence and maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment within the body. So each of our body's cells are surrounded by a small amount of fluid, and the normal functioning of those cells is dependent on the maintenance of its fluid environment within a narrow, normal range of conditions. These conditions, as we've seen again a little bit earlier on in the presentation, are known as variables, and they are subject to change. They thus need to be controlled. Variables include things like temperature, volume, as well as chemical content and a whole host of other conditions. So how do we control these variables? How do we maintain homeostasis? Well, one of the ways that the body can do this is by using feedback mechanisms. There are two types of feedback mechanisms in the human body, negative and positive. Now, typically, when we hear the term negative, we automatically think that it is something bad. But in the case of feedback mechanisms, this is not true. Negative feedback mechanisms are actually good. They are responsible for maintaining homeostasis. In fact, most systems in our bodies are regulated by negative feedback mechanisms. So why the term negative? Well, negative here means that any deviation in a variable from its set point, so say that the variable is maintained in this narrow range of normal, any deviation outside of that range, either greater or smaller, is made smaller or is resisted, in other words, is corrected by this negative feedback mechanism. So think of it as the body saying, no, thank you. I don't want to be outside this range of normal. I would like to get back into this range of normal, and this is where I want to stay. So the body is correcting variable deviations. An example of this would be maintaining normal blood pressure. The maintenance of normal blood pressure is essential for blood to be able to move adequately from the heart to cells and tissues throughout the body. So it is a negative feedback mechanism that helps control and maintain a normal blood pressure by regulating the variables that would affect blood pressure and that would threaten to raise it or lower it beyond this normal range. So negative feedback mechanisms are good. They are healthy. Positive feedback mechanisms, in contrast, are not homeostatic. In healthy individuals, they are rare. They're generally more indicative of some kind of pathological or disease state. Here, the term positive means that when there is a deviation from a normal value, so when we move outside that narrow range of normal with particular variables, the response of the positive feedback mechanism is to make that deviation even greater, so to move it even further outside the narrow range of normal. So, positive feedback mechanisms typically create cycles that lead away from homeostasis, and in some cases can even result in death. An example of a positive feedback mechanism to illustrate this would be the inadequate delivery of blood to cardiac muscle, such as this in the case of a heart attack. So let's be clear that in that particular example, the body is not necessarily sabotaging itself. It's not trying to kill itself. It's not trying to result in death. Rather, it's putting emergency measures into place to help sustain life, but that ultimately are going to be unsuccessful in sustaining life. And so the only way to not end up with death here would be to have some kind of medical intervention to correct that positive feedback mechanism and restore homeostasis. So I hope that makes sense. These are not necessarily the body like trying to sabotage itself. Rather, it's like an emergency measure that's designed to be temporary. It's not designed to sustain life for a long period of time. Rather, it's just focusing on survival at that particular moment in the hopes that something else will occur to correct the situation as a whole. So a couple of practice questions here to bring this home. Blank is a point in the functioning of a human body where everything is working optimally. Is it A, diffusion? Is it B, homeostasis? Is it C, metabolism? Or is it D, a variable? And as we have seen, the term homeostasis indicates a point in the functioning of a human body where everything is working optimally. All the variables are being maintained within their normal range, and the cells and tissues of the body can thus function normally. So this is the ideal state. This is what our bodies work to achieve. The term diffusion, excuse me just a second. So the term diffusion indicates that molecules are moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So the body certainly might use diffusion to help maintain homeostasis, but this term by itself does not have the definition that we're being asked about in our practice question. So this is an incorrect answer. Option C, metabolism, refers to chemical processes that help us maintain life and produce energy. So again, something valuable to the body, like diffusion, but does not quite fit with what we're being asked about in the practice question. So that's not a correct answer. And then D, variable, these are a variety of factors or conditions that are subject to change and thus need to be controlled. And that is necessary for the maintenance of homeostasis. So the control of variables is necessary for homeostasis, but the term variable does not describe the point in the functioning of a human body where everything is working optimally. So this is an incorrect answer as well, as all three of these have different definitions than what we're being asked about here. So homeostasis is the correct answer here. A person wakes up with a fever. The body begins its response to locate the origin of the problem and fix it. What type of feedback mechanism is this? Is it A, equal? Is it B, negative? Is it C, neutral? Or is it D, positive? And the correct answer here is option B. This is a good example of a negative feedback mechanism. So remember that negative feedback mechanisms help maintain homeostasis by correcting deviation in variables, such as temperature, and elevated temperature specifically, as in the case of this person with a fever. So we're being told that the body's response to the fever is to try to find out what's going on and to correct it. So this is a perfect example of a negative feedback mechanism. It is trying to correct a deviation in a variable. In this case, like we've said, elevated temperature. Remember that there are only two types of feedback mechanisms in the body, negative and positive. So we can automatically eliminate option A and option C because those are not types of feedback mechanisms that we see in our human bodies. Positive feedback mechanisms, if you'll recall, are not homeostatic. They're rare in healthy individuals and are more likely indicative of some kind of pathological or disease state. Instead of correcting deviations in variables, positive feedback mechanisms accentuate them. They make them larger. They make the deviation even greater. And that's not what we're seeing in this practice question. So that can't be our correct answer. So the best answer, as we've seen, is option B, negative, and that is the correct answer here. Remember, in the case of feedback mechanisms, negative is a good thing. Now, what about childbirth? Childbirth is a response to hormones in a woman's body. What type of feedback mechanism is at work during childbirth? Is it A, neutral feedback? Is it B, positive feedback? Is it C, negative feedback? Or is it D, need more information? And the correct answer here might surprise you, but it should make sense once we talk through it, and that is that this is an example of a positive feedback mechanism. So remember that I said positive feedback mechanisms are rare in healthy individuals. That does not mean that they are non-existent, but they are not homeostatic. So instead of correcting deviations in variables, again, positive feedback mechanisms make those deviations greater. In other words, this creates a cycle that leads away from homeostasis. So think about how childbirth works. The process of childbirth usually begins with symptoms that may be imperceptible at the time to the woman, like cervical dilation and effacement, the losing of the mucus plug, barely perceptible contractions initially. But this process is ramped up as the woman gets closer and closer to delivering her baby. And so what we end up with is a process that culminates in this baby being expelled from the woman's body, and then later the placenta. So you can see how this is leading away from the homeostatic state that the woman was in during her pregnancy. And the result is a drastic change in the woman's body as she actually delivers her baby. So homeostasis will be restored eventually, right? After delivery has been completed, it'll take the woman's body a while to get back to a state of homeostasis. So that will be accomplished eventually here. But the point of the positive feedback system is to move the body away from homeostasis. In this case, to accomplish something very healthy, the birth of this woman's child. So again, positive feedback mechanisms are rare in healthy individuals, but they do exist, and this is a good example of that. Neutral feedback is not one of the feedback mechanisms found in the human body, so that's an incorrect answer. And then negative feedback systems are homeostatic. They help us maintain that relatively constant, stable internal environment. And that is clearly not what is happening here, as we've just seen talking through this example. So this is an incorrect answer. Be really careful with answer options like option D, need more information. Sometimes that can be the correct answer, but before you select that, you really want to make sure that you know what the question is asking you and what each answer option means. And you really need to make sure that you genuinely do need more information to be able to answer the question. So just a plug for reading questions and answers really carefully as you're working through these exams and practice questions leading up to them, and really making sure you're taking the time to think through, what is this asking me? Does this appropriately answer the question before selecting an answer like that? Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and share this video with someone who is studying for the exam that could use some extra support. As a reminder, studying for the TEAS does not need to be difficult or scary. Our online course and mobile app makes it easy. Check it out at smarteditionacademy.com. All right, so that concludes our presentation on the organization of the human body. Hopefully you found that helpful to you. I know that that was a lot of different terms, particularly, and so if you need further review, I would commend to you the Smart Edition website. We have a lesson module with all of the same material. In fact, the PowerPoint presentation was organized in the same way that the lesson module is, so it should be fairly easy for you to reference where you need particular help if you need to review one particular topic. There's also a helpful video on the Smart Edition website, as well as a practice test that you can take with both text and video explanations walking you through the different answer options as well. So lots of helpful resources if you need further information or study on this particular topic, and I encourage you to take advantage of those. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time.